Okay, let's get ready to learn about mid-ocean ridge formation and function. So going back to what you learned in the last Hot Pad about the HMS Challenger expedition, remember this was the very first oceanographic expedition ever took place in the 1870s. Before this time, we knew basically nothing about what was in the depths of the ocean. And then they collected volumes and volumes and volumes of data, including depth, temperature, what organisms existed there, so on and so on. We talked a little bit before about how they actually measured depth. Remember, they didn't have modern devices. Today, we have sonar, which basically sends out a sound wave that bounces off the seafloor or echoes off the seafloor and then comes back to our instruments. We can record how long it takes for the sound wave to go out and bounce back. We know how quickly sound travels through water. So we can calculate how far away the depth of the ocean is, and we can map the ocean in a very high resolution in this way. Back then, though, they didn't have depth sounders, right? They didn't have these sonar machines. So instead, they had to use a lead line or a lead weight attached to the end of a very long line of rope. And they called these measurements soundings. We still call these measurements soundings today. What I think is really interesting is that today we use sonar, which uses sound. So it makes sense to call the modern day measurements soundings. Back in the HMS Challenger, though, they weren't using sound, but still they called them soundings. And it's a really interesting coincidence that back then, sounding had nothing to do with sound. It actually came from an Old English word called sund, S-U-N-D, that meant to travel through water. So they were measuring the depth of the water by traveling this lead weight through water. So they called it a sounding, which today we still call soundings, but it makes more sense today. So these scattered soundings on the HMS Challenger, when they collected these data, they would collect a sounding here, a sounding here, a sounding here. But, over a 3-year expedition, they can't collect a sounding at every single square inch of the seafloor. That's just too much, which meant they had a very low resolution map of the seafloor. They knew that here the depth was this much, here the depth was this much, and then they just drew a straight line between the two, and that made the ocean floor seem very flat. They found features, right? So, like, they would measure a shallow area, which we now know is a mid-ocean ridge. They would measure a deep area, which we now know is a trench. They weren't able to map out really the shapes of the mid-ocean ridge or the shapes of the trenches like we can do today. It wasn't until later in the 20th century that acoustic instruments were first used to map the seafloor with a higher resolution. And these data painted a picture of this like immense mountain chain on the seafloor, where the HMS Challenger might have said, yes, at this one point it's shallow. Well, later on in the 20th century, we could say, oh, hey, this shallow point is actually connected to all of these other shallow points. And if you map it, it looks like this huge mountain chain in the center of our oceans. So we were able to map what we now know as the ridge, right? Whose like elevations and cragginess rivals that of the Alps or the Sierra Nevada mountain chains. We knew that in the early 20th century. However, right in the 1920s, we knew that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was there. However, we didn't know what the Mid-Atlantic Ridge was, like why it was there, what formed it. And we also didn't know that it encircled the entire globe. We didn't realize it was also connected to every other ridge and every other ocean. It wasn't until the 1950s that Marie Tharp more thoroughly mapped the mid-ocean ridge and proposed plate tectonics, calling this that rift valley where the oceans were actually separating, right? So she found that first mechanism of plate tectonics and explained continental drift for the first time. And she did that. She started in the 1950s. Right. So recall the word sounding was first used as a depth finding method on the HMS Challenger expedition, in which the crew sent out acoustic signals and recorded the time it took for the echo to return from the seafloor. Is that true or false?